Hey everyone, welcome to the Incendium Growth Accelerator. I'm Nate Houghton, co-founder of Incendium, here with Tim He, co-founder of Cherrytree. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Really glad we could get you to join. I know you and I have chatted privately about some of the work you're doing. It's underutilized. I think it's something that anyone in startups should chat about, probably something that people sort of knowingly nod and understand. So I'll give the floor to you. I have some questions for sure, but to start with, you explained this to me recently when we chatted, the name. What is Cherrytree? Where did the name come from? Why do you call it
Yeah.
Cherrytree?
Yeah, Cherrytree. So basically, we help co-founders work better together. We have a newsletter and also a coaching program. And the reason why I named it Cherrytree is when you think of cherries, you think of them in twos or threes or little clusters, right? Just like co-founders. And the tree helps them all blossom. And so we think of ourselves as the cherry tree.
It makes sense. And I think it's kind of like a marriage probably, or any relationship where you have problems in relationships, even
Sure.
really good ones, because people are incredibly complicated. And I think like no matter how complicated the product that you're building is, your go-to-market strategy might be, the most complicated part of any organization is the individuals who are part of it, most notably the founders, who
Right.
are by definition insane people who could do other jobs and instead
Yeah.
choose to do this. So I don't know if you have like maybe a boilerplate or maybe a little deeper than a boilerplate story of like why you started doing this or how you started doing this. I don't
Yeah.
think we need too much of an explanation of why this is needed, but I'm
Right.
interested. Maybe the way to look at it is like, why haven't more people done this? Why is this like a relatively unique service?
Yeah, so to give you sort of the context on my story,
Yeah.
I did a startup a couple of years ago and just learned a lot about co-founder relationships. I started a company with my best friend and we're still best friends. Started a company with a stranger and we became friends. I started a company with a mutual friend who, it didn't quite work out with. And so I kind of saw the entire spectrum.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I was teaching entrepreneurship at Seattle. And a lot of my students would ask me the same questions about co-founders, like,
Mhm.
how do I find them? How do we split equity? They're not pulling their weight. I'm not pulling my weight, like, whatever it is, right? And
Yeah.
so I started writing about it for my students. And over, I think, 4 or 5 years, that, fat stack of notes became a book. And when I published that book, more people started reaching out to me, but it
Mhm.
wasn't just college kids anymore. It was people with quote unquote real companies, companies that I had applied to work at while I was in college. And so it
Mhm.
was like a light bulb moment when I realized that co-founder challenges and milestones and concerns are pretty universal. It doesn't really depend on your industry or your age or your experience level. These are just human questions that I've been thinking about really deeply for a really long time. And I think the reason why more people don't think about it as much as we should is like, when you're in a startup, you're thinking about moving fast and like breaking shit and scaling quickly. And one of the slowest things to build is actually relationships. You can't just like do a 2 week sprint and have a perfect product at the end of it. And so it tends to get neglected because it's not urgent. And
Mhm.
so the sort of analogy that I share with people is like, think about your co-founder relationship like your fitness. It's not a 1 week deal. It's for your entire life.
Mhm.
And a lot of people ignore it until they get a bad blood test, at which
Mhm.
point it's probably too late. It's one of those things where everybody can build good habits, although some people need it more urgently than others. And so you kind of have to have a little bit of self-awareness on where you are on the
Yeah.
spectrum.
And so we're dealing with psychology here, right? So like there's
Yeah.
probably no like real specific or immediate solutions. I guess the question that comes to mind for me is just thinking like a business owner, as you are, like maybe there are two parts of this. One is, what is the modal status when somebody shows up and they're like, Tim, we want to hire you? Is it bad? or are there more, is it a mix of people who are like, hey, we just think this is important? And then the second thing I want to ask, and I'm trying to do this very carefully, is every one of your engagements unique, truly unique? Or are there certain patterns that you see? Are you able to 80/20 anything where you're like, oh, if you guys just communicated on this better, are there certain things that you find that are very helpful? I'm curious if it's like that
Yeah,
too.
kind of. I'll answer the second question first. And
Yeah.
it kind of reminds me of how Hamlet, the play, and
Yeah.
Lion King kind of have the same plot.
Yeah.
They're like
Yeah.
totally different stories.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that,
Okay.
where you see the similarities, you see the same plot, arcs, but it's different characters, different settings, different everything, and different vibe, different
Mhm.
audiences,
Right.
and
Right.
but you see a lot of the similarities. So sometimes that makes it a little bit predictable, but not entirely, because
Mhm.
I'll think I know what's going to happen, and then the opposite happens, and I'm like, yeah, I did not see that coming.
Yeah, it's just totally surprised. Yeah.
Exactly. And so you're to your first question, it's really one of two options. A lot of people are curious. Maybe they just became co-founders. They don't necessarily need really heavy hands-on coaching. And that's when they discover the newsletter. It's like super easy, 1,000 words, and just top of mind stuff. And then there are the people who are, let's say, in a pretty pivotal time, like fundraising or key hiring or firing. And that's when they really want something more personalized, beyond just the newsletter. And that's when they reach out to me for more one-on-one stuff.
Do you start every engagement the same way, or is it just sort of like, let's have a conversation, or does it tend to be that the Lion King thing where it's the same plot and kind of certain things happen early on?
No, I would say it's actually pretty different depending on what where I'm parachuting into, where in that story I am.
Yeah.
And a lot of times there's so much background context that needs to be just for the co-founders to explicitly tell someone to actually think about it for the first time.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, the honeymoon phase of co-founders, first year, everything's perfect, working well together. And then at some point, maybe halfway throughout the second year, a couple months in, something happens and resentment starts to build, and maybe somebody feels guilty, or maybe, life happens, or, whatever the obstacle is. Then there's a little bit of tension. And so that's usually when people start looking for these solutions, but they don't realize that a lot of these warning signs and early, I wouldn't call them red flags, but just maybe beige flags have been present and existing since year one. It's not just all of a sudden something happens and shit goes wrong,
Yeah. Is it similar to like romantic relationships at all? Like, or is it totally different? What is it?
No, a lot of people compare co-founderships to marriages or dating.
Yeah, you hear that all the time. Yeah.
I see it, but it's like, I'm not convinced, because my relationship with my co-founder is totally different from my relationship with my girlfriend, as they should be. I think there are similarities in that you spend a lot of time together, you talk about your emotions and your vision and plans, that kind of stuff. That can be similar, sure. But I think with a co-founder relationship, there's just so much performance and professional career, metrics that are tied to it that you don't necessarily have in a romantic relationship. The one caveat, though, I will say is maybe it's more similar to being a parent together, because you're, building something, you're raising someone. I'm not a parent, so I don't know, but I've also heard that analogy being thrown out quite a lot.
Yeah. So shift gears a little bit. Can we talk about like your business? I'm curious, like how it works. What are the mechanics? Who are you working with? How do you organize your time? Like, how do you get paid? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Let's see. How do I get paid? That's pretty easy. The newsletter has sponsors for, from companies who want to advertise to startup founders.
Yeah.
Straight and easy. I get paid per click or per impression. And so the more subscribers I have, the more clicks I get, the more I get paid. The other component is the coaching, and that's a monthly flat fee starting at $500 per month. And that includes weekly calls and sort of anytime texting or emergency calls with co-founders. And the two of those components make up the revenue model for Cherrytree.
What's the split roughly, and has it changed over time?
Yeah, the newsletter was free for a very long time, free of ads and sponsorships, because I was just trying to grow that. And so that only recently started making a little bit of money.
Oh, cool. Okay. And I guess, just from the perspective, we're a growth organization. I've been really fascinated with how I love businesses that are so organic like this, right? Where like the way you described it, I think is perfect. You're like, I had people asking me these questions. I answered the questions. Eventually I had enough. Effectively, I had a book. And then the newsletter, it seems to me, based on what you said before, and this is probably true, like drives a lot of the business. It's really, effective that way. So I'm interested in thinking about, like, for you, how do you maintain the way that the business is versus how ambitious you want to be with it? Like, could you ever imagine a place in which you have a bunch of coaches in your methodology? Or do you think it's more like, this is something that I like to do and I want to do on my own, or like what big sort of go to market versus the organic stuff that's happening now?
Yeah, I'll give you quite a long answer for this one if we have the time.
I'm curious.
When I first started, it was actually a totally different model that I envisioned. I wanted to make a community of co-founders who come together and talk about co-founder stuff, because nobody else quite gets it.
True.
Like there's no way to explain it. You just have to talk to someone who's like lived that experience. And in theory, that worked really well because I did that on a small scale with my friends. We'd get together at dinner and just talk about the ups and downs of being a co-founder. Problem is, this doesn't scale because people don't want to air their dirty laundry out in public. They don't want to be talking about these things with, a community of hundreds of people. And when you get investors involved and there's impression management, you don't want to talk shit about your co-founder in public,
Right.
all that kind of stuff. And what if your co-founder's in the community? Like, what do you do then?
Right.
And that doesn't work. And so I thought, okay, maybe we can split off into like small groups, and it didn't work out quite how I wanted to. And so the other thing I was looking at while I was researching this was other co-founder coaches. And there's not a lot of us. There's maybe a dozen that I found in total. And I wanted to make kind of like a marketplace for co-founder coaches. And so that was interesting, but I didn't have any traffic at that point because I hadn't started the newsletter, I hadn't started broadcasting. And so all these co-founder coaches were, interested in theory. They're like, yeah, sure, I'll sign up, no harm, no foul. And
Why not? Yeah.
And then like nobody would show up, and I'm like, all right, well, this doesn't work. So I was like, okay, I need some sort of distribution system, right? I need to get it out. The other problem was after talking to these existing co-founder coaches, I realized that they were either the co-founder of Reddit, who now coaches people for like $3,000 a minute, like they have a PhD in psychology or they're a psychiatrist, but they have no idea what it's like running a company. And so it's like, and they also charge like $500 an hour.
Right.
It's some random dude on Reddit who's giving you advice and you're like, I don't know if I trust that. And so I kind of wanted to be in between those. Right? I wanted to be the person who would serve myself when I was a co-founder. I didn't want to spend $1,000 on a session, but I also didn't want to just rely on Quora and Reddit and YouTube. I had real questions to ask. And so that's sort of how I came to this realization that in order for me to position myself as somebody sort of in that middle market, I needed to build some sort of credibility. And so that's where the book came in. I went on TV to talk about this kind of stuff, podcasts, panels, and just like putting my stuff out there to build this presence. And so that's how it started growing. And then more people started finding me and, kept snowballing from there.
Very cool. So for the last little while here, just kind of we'll call this the podcast portion or sort of the rapid fire portion here. And I know I didn't prep you for this at all, but like in terms of like very practical tips for co-founders, anyone who's watching this hoping to actually be able to take away something that they can do like tomorrow, what are 3 or 5 or whatever you usually have on like boilerplate type stuff?
Yeah, rapid fire is do a co-founder sync that doesn't touch on anything work related. So talk about your hobbies or your interests or life outside of work. Talk about something outside of work, probably somewhat frequently, depending on your situation. That's like the first bucket. The second one is like understand what makes conversations tough. It's easier said than done to like just have the tough conversations, just talk it out and communicate. That's really hard to do. That's why people don't do it. Me telling you to do it is not going to just work, but at least being cognitive of what makes it hard is like a good first step. So whenever you feel like you're maybe second guessing yourself or censoring yourself, just like take a moment and just think about it. Just be aware of it. I think that's another good first step. The other is if you have a team who are, who report to you and your co-founder, then really try to notice how they interact with each other. Sort of like a Nat Geo, like look at my team in the wild type of thing. Right. It's a really good reflection of how they perceive the co-founder relationship. It's a mirror. It's like, the kids and the parents. It's sort of like a pendulum, like a little wiggle at the top makes a big swing at the bottom. And so really look at how they interact with each other. I think that those would be my top 3 like things you could do right now.
That makes sense. Very helpful. We'll cut these out and put them on LinkedIn for people for sure. They can use them. Interesting question I just thought of as well is why when your engagements end, I imagine there's some like their company didn't work. What are some of the outcomes where you're like, oh, this is in a better place now? Or like, do you find there's lasting impact? Or what are some of the things that you like to see before they stop working with you?
Yeah. I think they need to be able to separate the friendship from the company and the co-foundership. I've had co-founders leave me, but we still are great friends. And I've also had co-founders stay with me, but the friendship deteriorated. So it's really important to separate the two. I know co-founders who have sued each other when they split up. I also know co-founders who voluntarily gave their shares to the other because it just wasn't the right fit. And so you have to prioritize the friendship. That's, again, a lot of this stuff is easier said than done, but that's just the ideal if you're asking about perfect scenarios. A lot of the lasting impact is like, think about your first romantic relationship, maybe in high school or middle school or whatever. Most of those don't work out, right? The same way as most companies don't work out. But that doesn't mean most founders don't work out, because they're just going to go off and start another company the same way you're going to get another partner once you graduate high school, right? And so like the first failed experience doesn't really define you as an entrepreneur or as a person, but it does have an impact on your reputation. The founder community is pretty sizable, but everybody talks, right? And so no matter how you end your co-founder relationship, first, you still, ideally would want to be friends. But if that's, if that's off the table, then at least don't do anything crazy stupid that will tarnish your reputation, right? And third is, if you are going to go to litigation and whatnot, I know a few people who specialize in this for their careers, and they always rant to me and vent about how ugly it gets. So just before you do that, consider that, but do what you will.
So if somebody is going through co-founder breakups, much like romantic breakups, like what are some things that they can learn about themselves that maybe they don't often like think about? Because I think you make a really good point. Like a lot of people get married, even though the vast majority of relationships don't work out. Like what are some things that people should learn about how they work? I think there's probably a lot of focus on the other person and like why they didn't do something the right way.
Exactly. I think the first thing that comes to mind is learning how we deal with stress and different types of stress. There's 5 types of ways that people deal with stress. And this isn't my stuff. I forget her name, but there was a researcher who came up with all 5. I think you can find it if you just search like 5 stress languages. But I believe it was like some people get aggressive and explode. Some people distract themselves with other things or even overworking. Some people I forget what it was, like do other stuff, like watch TV or procrastinate or whatever else. Some people implode and sort of internalize and shut down. Other people like cross boundaries to like try to fix the problem and overstep things. And so depending on what's causing the stress, people have different reactions to it. And so like if I'm stressed because I have a deadline, then I'll like overwork and then underwork. Like I'll do the thing and then I'll take some time off, but probably too much time. Right? But if I'm stressed about a person, then I get pretty avoidant. I'll like shut off because I don't want to hurt their feelings, or I don't want to, those are just my tendencies. And so I think if there is a breakup for whatever reason, even if it's just the circumstances, understanding how you react to different types of stress and what situations and to what extent is something that's really powerful for your next adventure.
Last question for you. Where can people find you? How can they, if they want to chat further, like what should they do?
Yeah, cherrytree.app is my website that has the coaching and the newsletter, or you can find me on LinkedIn at Tim He, Timhe.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Great chatting with you. We appreciate it. Talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.